want to ask you to come with me on a journey. A journey that started 3 years ago when I thought I knew what my life would look like. And I had no idea. A journey that has shown me more about the Father's heart and His extravagant compassion than I could have ever imagined. A journey that requires me to give more of myself every single day. It's a journey that took me from a 10-month commitment to teach kindergarten in Uganda to a lifetime commitment of bettering and serving this country. I'm Katie Davis. I'm 21 years old and I live here in Uganda. I run Amazima Ministries and my full-time occupation is that I'm a mom to 14 little girls. From an early age, people would always ask me, you'd have like career day, what do you want to be when you grow up type thing, and I had always said I wanted to be Mother Teresa just because I guess I just loved her heart for children. It is my 16th birthday and I'm eating sushi at my favorite restaurant when I tell my parents that I'd like to explore the possibility of doing mission work out of high school. I graduate high school having made a commitment to teach at a preschool for a year in the middle of nowhere, Uganda. My parents were so not on board, but it came to a point where it was like, okay, God said you choose me or you choose to please your dad, and what's it going to be? And I said, all right, I'm going back. It is January and I'm looking at a little girl crushed under a brick wall with no one to take care of her and her siblings. I offer to take them home with me until we find a better solution. I'm not really sure what to do with them, but I know that they are God's children. They stay. It is 3 days later, and the littlest one looks up and she calls me Mommy. My heart breaks in two. I have no idea what to do, but something clicks. I'm even more scared than the day that I stepped on that plane, but I know that this is right. Today I have 14. I get a lot of that, like, do you really feel that they're your children? Do you really feel like it's a family? And I say, you come on over for dinner and tell me, because it is our family. People say to me all the time, like, wow, you are so lucky that you found what God wants you to do with your life. And I kind of look at those people and think, like, well, I didn't find it. It was just in the Bible. And so as someone who calls themselves a Christian, it's very apparent that you are to love the Lord with all your heart, and then you're to love your neighbor as yourself. And like, myself doesn't want to be starving. And so I don't want other people in the world to be starving. Jesus does not ask that we care for the less fortunate. He demands it. When calling ourselves Christ followers, caring for orphans and the desolate and the widow are not an option. It's a requirement. I would like to invite you to come with me on this journey that is so far from over and see what God will do next.
BrookHills, will you welcome Katie Davis to our faith family? Now, I know from being around Katie, from reading everything she's written, and just her countenance and the way she carries herself, that her desire is that Christ would be exalted in her, that this story is so much more about Christ than it is Katie Davis. And so I want to ask you to give us a little bit of a glimpse tonight into Christ in you. So let's kind of start from the beginning. A short-term trip to Uganda. So tell us how that came about and what that was like.
Right, so I never had Uganda specifically in mind. I just wanted to go somewhere overseas and help out. I'd done a lot of volunteer work downtown in Nashville, where I'm from, and wanted to look at what that looked like in a third world country, and so just began applying to different orphanages that I found online. And one in Uganda, the director was really sweet and good about communicating and said, sure, we'll take a volunteer. So I spent a good couple months trying to convince my mom to come with me on this trip. And during my senior year of high school on my Christmas break, we went over there for 3 weeks, and I immediately fell in love with the people and the country. And I think I was so overwhelmed by this need that was unlike any kind of poverty I had ever experienced. And I fell more in love with Jesus and wanted to take his word at face value. And so as soon as I stepped back on American soil, I knew I had to get back. He had opened my eyes to this need, and I didn't know what I would do about it, but I knew I had to do something.
So that led to thinking through a little longer. So 3 months, not enough, maybe a year in Uganda, then come back and live a normal life
Right.
after that in the United States. So you go back for a year to teach. So give us a glimpse into what that was like.
Right, so that's exactly what I thought. I had met this pastor while I had been in Uganda who was looking to start a school program for his orphanage. He was paying so much money for the kids in his orphanage to go to outside schools. So he wanted to start small with a kindergarten. And I mean, over the last years, that has slowly grown into other grades. And he said, I'd love for you to come and just help me kind of develop the infrastructure and the class structure. And I said, well, I'm not a teacher. And he said, well, God has placed it on my heart to ask you to come back. And so, like I said, as soon as I got back to America, I was like, okay, I'll do anything that you asked me to do to come back. And so got on a plane after I graduated high school, thought I'll take this year off, do this missions thing. I think my parents thought she'll get it out of her system, and we all thought I'll come back and go to college and have, normal life.
Right.
I get to Uganda, and it's actually so uncomfortable. I was happy to be there. I loved the people, but I was so much more uncomfortable than I had ever been, coming from Brentwood, Tennessee, which is a community very similar to this one. And I remember the first morning I walked into this barn that they had turned into a classroom, and it was no bigger than one of these sections of seats, but there were 140 little kids just packed in there, just back to back to back. And they didn't speak English, and most of them had never seen a white person. Maybe some of them had seen like a white person in passing, but never really interacted with one. And so I walked into the front of this barn classroom thing, and I said, hello, and everyone said, their little white eyeballs were popping out of their heads, and I said, how are you? And they said, and one kid in the corner kind of started to cry, and I was like, oh, no.
So do we have any teachers here tonight who have 140 kids in your classroom who speak a different language? Anybody familiar with this? Okay. I think you're alone on this one. So, overwhelming.
Absolutely overwhelming. And so I would spend the mornings just with, part of my job was supposed to be to teach them English, because they teach English in Ugandan schools. And so I would stand in the front of the room with a ball, and I would say, this is a ball. And they would all say, this is a ball. And then I'd hold up a pencil and say, this is a pencil. And they would repeat. And we'd do it with various objects. And inevitably, at the end of the day, a child would come up with a pencil and say, this is a ball.
They got the first part right, so that's good. They were learning.
Right.
That's good.
So I'm, you're in this moment of, okay, God, you picked the wrong person. So sorry. Over the next few weeks, though, we were able to find some local teachers and some good translators that were able to come alongside me, and we divided the kids up into little groups of 30, and we just kind of taught outside in the orphanage compound under these trees, and so it got better. It got better.
Now, in the process, the Lord began to burden your heart for the need for education for children in Uganda in a way that has played out in just amazing ways since then. So tell us why. Why is education so important? Why is that such a burden on your heart, and how's that played out?
Right. I think that I began to see two needs as I was teaching. I would notice a child or two children would stop coming to school for a week or two at a time, and so I was making friends with my translator, Oliver, and she is a woman from the community who knew a lot of the people in the community, and I would say, can we go visit this child? Can we see why they haven't come back to school? And the problem was that a lot of them were living with a single mom or a single dad, or maybe they were completely orphaned, and so they were living with a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, someone who really wanted to care for this child but was struggling just to put food on the table, and so was not able to pay the minimal amount that the orphanage was charging for school fees. Then I also saw parents who loved their children. Their children aren't orphans, but they were bringing them to drop them off at the orphanage, because if you live at the orphanage, you get to eat 3 times a day, and you get medical care, and you get to attend school. And so these people, out of love for their children and knowing that they couldn't provide these things at home, wanted to leave them at this institution, which was already just overcrowded. And so I said, surely there has to be a way that these children can stay with their families and still have their basic needs met. And the parents and guardians of these children so badly want them to be educated because many of them grew up uneducated, and that has caused them to be able to not have a job. And in not having a job, they haven't been able to provide for their children. And so they want for their children to be educated, to have a different kind of life. So that just looked like, calling my parents, emailing friends, saying, if you can make a small donation, I'll use it to feed this child or to get this child to come back to school, and that'll help keep this family unit together. And as 10 turned into 40 and 40 turned into 100, that's how Amazima, the ministry that I run today, was born.
So somewhere along the way in all of the teaching and education, the Lord began to shift from teacher to mom in a way that you probably did not see coming. So tell us about Agnes.
Yeah, so adoption entered my world, and before I even knew it was called that. It was about January, Amazima had been established and was growing quickly, and so we needed a place to call our office so that we could register as a nonprofit with the Ugandan government as well as with the U.S. government. And so I had been kind of house hunting, looking for something tiny, just a one room. I'd been living in one room at the orphanage, and that had been plenty. And it's Uganda, so there are like 3 houses available to rent. And I just kept coming back to this one that was kind of big and had 4 bedrooms and this little tiny kitchen. And I just kept saying, no, this is way too big for me. And the landlord would lower the rent, and I would say, oh, that's nice of you, but this is still too big. And I really felt God just impressing upon me, this is your house. And I was like, no, it's not. It's too big. But as the landlord continued to lower the rent, it wouldn't have even made sense to live in a smaller house because it was the same price. And so started renting this house. Just a couple weeks later, a house actually fell down the road from me, and it landed on this 9-year-old Agnes. And so Oliver said to me, we have this little girl, she was under this brick wall, we have to go and pray for her. She'd been taken to the hospital. So we went, and when we got to the hospital, we found Agnes just lying in a hospital bed, and no one had given her any kind of care because the hospital staff couldn't find a parent or a guardian who was going to pay for the care when it was given. And so they had just allowed her to lie there in the hospital bed but not really done anything. And so I said, okay, go ahead and do whatever you need to do. I'll figure out a way to pay for it. But I began asking Oliver, where is the parent or guardian? Why is there no one taking care of her? And she said, oh, well, their dad died a couple years ago, and so Agnes at 9 and her 7-year-old and 5-year-old sister, Mary and Scovia, they'd all just been living in this little house together. And so I'm thinking, no way, like, who cooks for them and who takes care of them? And she just continues to insist they take care of each other. They are living in this house by themselves. And so I'm thinking now, not only are a 7- and 5-year-old without their sister, who's their primary caregiver, they're without their house because it's fallen down. And so we went to visit them, and it wasn't, I didn't think like, oh, I'll adopt you. I just thought, you don't have a house, I have a house. You can come stay at mine while we figure it out. And so just began, I'd seen sponsorship work now, so began looking for a biological family for these children, thinking we'll get them a sponsor and we'll figure this out. And after several weeks of searching for family and not really finding anyone biologically related or in the community who could take care of these children, and just in prayer, God really began to confirm you are the family for these girls that you are searching for. And simultaneously with that, Scovia, the youngest, began calling me mommy, and he just really made it apparent that he had. We had grown together and we were becoming a family even really without me knowing it. So that's when I began the foster care process and started paperwork with them to one day finalize those adoptions.
So that was Agnes, Mary, and Scovia. Then came along Prosy and Margaret, then Sermine, then Joyce, then Sarah. For those keeping score at home, that is 8 children in a year. That's a lot. So 1 year in Uganda, just a simple year. You come back to the United States, but you knew your heart was in Uganda. So tell us what that was like, because you had said, okay, I'll come back after this year, but obviously with girls, with the ministry going on there. So tell us about just the wrestling you experienced when you came back here.
Oh my gosh, I was completely broken. Even still, it's just hard to think about that. So hard. But God is very clear, honor your mother and your father. And I had made this promise to my parents that I will come back. And so I felt like I had to come back. I also felt like it was completely wrong to come back. It was so apparent what God was doing in my life in Uganda. It was so apparent to me that Uganda was not a year. Uganda was a lifetime. So I did come back, and it was just completely uncomfortable. It felt like turning my back on what God was trying to do in my life, and that's a horrible feeling. So don't ever do that. If God is telling you to do something, just go. But it was also uncomfortable to re-enter this world, because for the last year I had like 2 choices of food, and you walk into a grocery store in America and you have 12 choices of food that you can pick for your dog. And I think that God had stripped me of so many material things during my year in Uganda, and even relationships. He's been really faithful to build good community and good relationships around me now in Uganda. But at that point, I didn't have a lot of friends. I didn't have very much of a support system. But as he stripped that all away, he seemed to get so much nearer, and just so much closer, because there wasn't anything else to rely on other than God. And so my relationship with him had so deepened that it was hard to come back here and feel like there were all these distractions and all these other things. And I remember even writing about a time when it felt like I was kind of able to step out of reliance on God if I wanted to, because I had all this stuff. And so I would kind of just unconsciously do that, and that was horribly uncomfortable.
So then you decided to take a one-way trip back to Uganda, and along came Helen and Jane and Zula and Tivita and Grace, and then Patricia. For those keeping count, that is 14 girls. But a journey not without heartbreak. So tell us about Jane.
Jane was abandoned by her birth parents when she was about 3 months old, and everyone in the family was kind of trying to pick up the slack, but just couldn't. Aunts and uncles each had multiple children of their own, were trying to work hard to support these children, and so Jane just got passed around from relative to relative to relative. And when she was between 1.5 and 2, I started noticing her just wandering around on the dirt path near our home. And so I would invite her in for lunch, and then she would fall asleep on the floor and take a little nap at our house. And then I would walk her home, and sometimes we would look around for, a guardian or an adult and not find anyone. And so she would spend the night at my house, and that's kind of how I began the conversation with her aunt of, is there anyone to really take care of this child? Because if there's absolutely no one, then I'll foster her. And so began the process to foster Jane. Did police report and did ad in the paper to look for biological parents, and no one turned up. About 2.5 years later, into the process of fostering Jane. In Uganda, you have to foster for 3 years before you can finalize an adoption, and you have to be 25. So we're just kind of waiting that out. But about 2.5 years later, a woman shows up at my door, and she's Nancy. She says she's Jane's birth mom. She would like her child back, and I'm like, how? Where did you come from? How did you find me? And she actually has Jane's birth certificate to prove that Jane is hers, which, most of my kids most people that I know in Uganda don't even have a birth certificate. And so, I called the social worker who works for the government who gives me custody of my children, and I said, what do I do? And he said, well, you can go to court if you want. And so we did, and custody was granted back to her birth mom, and that was so hard. It was devastating. It felt in a lot of ways like losing a child. And they lived about 5 hours from us for the first several months. This was last October. It's been almost a year. And then in April or May, Nancy showed up at the door, and just, again, with Jane. And she said, I lost my job. I've been evicted from my house. I don't have anywhere to go. I don't know how to parent this child. And so we opened our gate a little wider, and Jane and Nancy both came to live with us for a little while. And we've since been able to find Nancy a job. She's working for Mazima doing some translation stuff for us, and she and Jane live down the street. And I've really It's been really cool to see how God's redemption is so beautiful in so many different ways, because I spend my whole life trying to advocate for children to stay in their biological family. That's the whole idea of sponsorship. And so while I love adoption and I'm so happy and privileged to be the mom of my children, I also recognize that there's been huge tragedy in their life to bring them to a place of needing to be adopted. And so I think it's so great that God can choose to redeem that in adoption into a family. And in Jane's case, God chose to bring Nancy back into her life and redeem that relationship. And he's just really spoken to me. I did this because I don't just want Jane to have a family. I want Nancy to have a family. And I don't just want Jane to know me. I want Nancy to know me. And so they're friends now, and they're around and doing well.
Do you think what you're doing is radical?
It's just what is natural and what comes from relationship with Jesus and an overflow of the love that he's given me in my life. And I think that what I'm doing is abnormal, but I don't think that it should be.